So, in a class about aquatic plants, of course, we're going to be concerned with how aquatic plants do their sexual reproduction a little bit differently, or at least, be aware for the possibility that there is a difference. And one of the major themes in aquatic plants is that they often don't depart very far from the way that their ancestors, their terrestrial ancestors, were pollinated. So if you compare a plant living in the water, like this pondweed or I'm sorry, knotweed on the left here, living in the water with its flowers raised above the water, compare that to this one, which is a wetland plant, but more terrestrial plant. And their flowers are basically the same. So you might expect some modifications, but often, if it's still working, so you do pollination the way that your relatives and your ancestors did, then they just keep doing that. So in all these examples here, you could compare these plants to a closely related plant, and they have essentially the same flowers. And of course, notice that the flowers are above the water. So what is the issue for an aquatic plant? Well, one of the issues is that pollen does not really work with water. So if you get a flower that gets wet, gets rained on, gets splashed, the pollen is not usually ready to undergo that kind of exposure. So wet things get sticky, they get moved around, carried around. So generally speaking, uh, if your pollen gets wet, certainly for a terrestrial plant and also for a lot of aquatic plants, if your pollen gets wet, it completely loses its ability to end up on the flower where it needs to go. And I used to think they like to say in aquatic plants uh, that water is sort of disastrous for pollen. Um, it's not really like the water is deactivating the pollen or anything so much as the water just like makes it unable for this pollen to get where it was going to go. So it's not going to get picked up by an animal. It has no ability to float on the wind. If it's already in the water, it's now stuck to a surface. And so it's not really a profound reason why wet pollen shouldn't work. This is true for terrestrial plants and also for a ton of aquatic plants. So generally speaking, sort of, if you get wet and you're a pollen grain, that's the end of your journey. You are not going to make it that year. So we see some evidence if you sort of take that case where I was just talking about, where the pollen grains don't like to get wet, and kind of look for evidence that plants might be avoiding that. You take a plant and you put it in the water, it's increasing the chance that water is going to end up on the flowers. And so we see some modifications in aquatic plants that seem to indicate that they are avoiding getting water on them. So if you have a flower at the water surface, splashing is a possibility. And we see some modifications like really long stalks in this pipewort. A little hard to tell, but it looks like the water level is near where these leaves are. And then the flower stalks are much higher above the water. So reduce or eliminate the chance that the pollen there is going to get wet. Similar thing here, we have buoyancy assistance, where the part of the plant that's very, very buoyant, very good at floating, is right next to where the flowers are. So that's going to keep it from sinking underwater. And then this water lily, just an instance of sort of a shielding, right? So this plant has a lot of layers of petals on the outside and the pollen toward the middle. So if there was a low level splashing or some wave action around this flower, could be deflected by those petals and sepals around the outside. So just some of what we see is modifications. Some a little bit more elaborate modifications. So I mentioned in the previous slide the buoyancy. Sometimes we see structures that are pretty elaborately and apparently deliberate for getting these flowers out of the water. This plant on the right here, this is the inflated bladderwort, and it's got this ring of spongy tissue erenchyma supports that kind of make a stable platform at the water surface. And then the flowers are still produced considerably high above that to keep them away from the water. This plant, Hautonia inflata, very obviously good at floating. It's got parts that are full of parenchyma, particularly around where these flowers are produced. And then the contrast with the feathery, dissected leaves underwater. A little hard to see here on this kabamba. There's some floating leaves that are assisting with these flowers staying above water. And then this plant, Nymphoides, there's a handful of Nymphoides that have this floating leaf that's very closely associated to where their flowers are produced. So you can't really see it, but underwater, this flower stalk is connected to a bit of stem that's right connected to that leaf. So the leaf and flower combination, they float together and they're very, very closely associated. So for this flower to go underwater, it would sort of have to take the whole leaf with it, which makes it very resistant to sinking. One pattern that we see in these flowers above the water, not universal, but of course I've grabbed a bunch of examples here. Typically we find them with white petals. So a couple of possible explanations for that. One is that white is a pretty good contrast against either green leaves, which is often in these water environments, often the surface is covered by the leaves of the same plant, or also a good contrast against water, which has sometimes a rather dark color to it. So white flower, good contrast. Another potential explanation is that a lot of times water plants, they might lose their more elaborate chemical defenses, chemical attractants, things like that. They get sort of simplified down chemically, including the pigments that might be helping them to produce flower colors. And so white is not really a color biochemically. White is just the absence of colorful molecules. So petals of a plant, the white petals of a flower are just basically cells without green of chlorophyll and without any other pigments. They just end up reflecting all light, which looks white to us. Okay, so we see some flowers avoiding the water, and there's a small number, and these are the ones that are particularly fun to talk about, these plants that really embrace their watery environment and use it as how they get their pollen around.